she's running. So she's running to represent first-year students. So I think this has can have potentially a really big impact on all of you guys. So I want to let her speak just for a minute, a couple minutes, whatever. And she's going to talk to us about her platform, her political philosophy. Okay, maybe not that stuff, but she's going to talk to us right now. So Monica, it's all you.
Hi. Have you guys heard about the UTM-SU first year representative elections? Raise your hands if you did. Yeah. So today's the last day for elections. I would greatly appreciate it if you guys take a minute of your time to vote for me, Monica Victoria. Two of my main platform points are I'm going to try to bring in more of the great fast food restaurants to campus, maybe like Panda Express, Matthew Walk. And then the second main platform point will be have certain non-MyWay buses accept the U-Pass, because I know a lot of you guys commute outside of Mississauga, so I guess it would be really helpful if you don't have to pay for another extra bus fare for transportation. So the polling stations will be located at IB, right here. If you guys go outside your class, there's one nearby. Davis, Deerfield, CCT, and MAM. And the voting ends at 6 p.m., so make sure to vote before 6, and thank you.
Okay,
My name is Monica.
Why does she get applause and I do not get applause? Seriously, I want answers. So if you guys want Panda Express and you want free bus tickets, vote for Monica. And I can tell, I just met Monica, but I can tell she's a very nice person. And she'll do right by us, right? You will do right by us, you promise?
Yes.
Okay, she's going to do right by us, so vote for Monica. Okay, there you go. Okay, is there anything else, Monica? Okay, good. She's going to give me $20 after class. She's going to buy me some Panda Express, and it's going to be totally awesome. Okay, good. So here we go. We're going to start lecture. Is that okay? It's not time to go home yet. I know. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 17th century England. 17th century England. We're going to finish off the reign of James I. So we're going to finish off the reign of James I. And we're going to talk about Charles II. Hopefully, by the end of today's class, what we're going to do is get us all the way up to the eve of the English Revolution. Right? So we're going to go from, hopefully, for today's class, we're going to get to about 1620, right, 1620, to about, I don't know, 1640. Okay, so that's sort of what we're hoping to do for today's class. So before I talk anymore, or before we get into the actual lecture stuff, I just sort of want to review just a little bit from where we were our last class. So we talked in our last class about James I, right? That was the last class. This is History 101. Okay, good. So we were talking about James I, right? And how James I has gotten sort of wants to deal with them. He wants to confront these problems head on. So what's he do? They have a powwow. They get together, hold hands, and sing kumbaya. What do they do?
They have a negotiation.
He what?
Yeah, they have a negotiation.
Okay, great. So they have they all get together at the Hampton Court Conference, right? So James he comes to the throne in 1603, and it's like a year afterwards, right? That James is convoking some of the big minds together to sort of like hash out the problems in the English church. So like, what happens as the result of the Hampton Court Conference? What happens? They get together, hold hands, and sing kumbaya. What do they do? Yep, in the back.
They don't really do much except they translate the Holy Bible into English.
Okay, great. So they provide the official translation of the English Bible, which is, of course, the King James Bible. Fantastic. We talked about James's political beliefs, right? So James, his political beliefs center on divine right rule, right? And we talked about what divine right rule is, that James sort of sees himself as, of course, the lieutenant of God on earth, right? And that with that comes specific responsibilities, right? I think you guys had a paper due today. Good, so we know something about this, right? So he wrote a lot about divine right. We talked about some of the problems that James had in his reign, particularly the problem of favorites. Someone tell me about who's James' main, who's his main squeeze? You got it? Yeah. Okay, so this is the Duke of Buckingham, right? So the Duke of Buckingham is James's main squeeze, right? And this is going to cause a lot of problems for James. Why so? Igor? Okay, great. So he gives Buckingham a ludicrous amount of money. Okay, why else? Why else are the nobles upset with the Duke of Buckingham? Yep.
He was appointed to admiral of the Navy, studying and stepping on ships.
Okay, great. So James is giving the Duke of Buckingham, this low-born person, right, all of these titles of nobility, right? And my point is that it was not James's homosexuality that got him in trouble, but rather conferring titles of nobility, right, this high status stuff, to this low-born guy. So this, of course, contributes to James's, I'm going to fall over this, okay, good. This, of course, contributes to James's crisis of finances. And I think that this is where we kind of left off our story. So that's where I'm going to pick up, right? So we're talking about James's crisis of finances, right? We talked about the problem of favorites. We talked about the interpretation of James's reign. Now we're going to talk about this crisis of finances that James had. So what James is going to try to do, right? Historically, kings in the 17th century in England were supposed to live on their own, right? They weren't supposed to have to rely on Parliament for subsidies or for revenue, right? So they're not supposed to rely on Parliament, but they're supposed to sort of like live on their own. So what James is going to do, and the story that I'm going to tell you, is that James tries to raise extra parliamentary taxation, right? So in other words, James is going to try to raise revenue against Parliament. In some sense, so this is a sort of ambiguous point that historians always talk about. The traditional kind of interpretation of what James is about to do is that he's breaking the law through raising taxes in illegal ways, right? Recent historians have sort of revised this view. Recent historians have instead emphasized that James isn't necessarily breaking the law, right? But he is acting kind of shifty. Okay, kind of shifty is my phrase, but that's exactly what he's doing, right? So he's going to try to raise revenue by sort of breaking tradition, but sort of not breaking tradition, right? So what James is doing is shifty, but it isn't technically illegal. Do you see what I'm saying? Yep. We'll talk. Great. So James, the point that I'm making is that James is going to kind of break with tradition. And this is going to rub people the wrong way. So what James, so let me give you an example, right? So this is James' Crisis of Finances, and it could be like in your notes, acting kind of shit, breaking tradition. So what he does, for instance, James is like, okay, so I love Buckingham, I'm giving Buckingham all my money, all of this sort of stuff. And he's like, how can I raise revenue, right? How can I bring money in? I'm supposed to live on my own. So what he does is he starts selling titles of nobility, right? So in other words, you could say that James is sort of like cheapening the social hierarchy on which his authority rests. He's like, oh, you know, you didn't do anything noble to earn this title, right? But I'm going to sell titles of nobility to people that are able to pay the most money for them. So for instance, James sells 904 knighthoods, right? He's just sort of like, I need money, I'm just gonna knight people, domini, and knighting people all day. That's sort of what he does. So 904 knights in the first 4 months of his reign, right? So he comes to the throne, and you could say that it's almost as though he starts like cheapening the nobility from the get-go, right? The guy knights 904 knights in the first 4 months of his reign. I don't know what else he was doing in the first 4 months of his reign, but he was pretty preoccupied knighting knights. To give you some sort of example of how unprecedented this was, Queen Elizabeth, you know, Kate Blanchett played Queen Elizabeth and all of this in the movies. Queen Elizabeth ruled from 1558 to 1603. Like 45 years Elizabeth reigned. In those 45 years that Elizabeth reigned, she knighted 600 people, right? So in 45 years, Elizabeth knighted 600 people. James, like, sets foot in England and knights 904 people, right? So this is sort of like, he's not breaking the law. It's within the purview of his authority to be able to knight all of these people. But he's sort of acting outside of, this is unprecedented, and this is sort of untraditional, right? So he's acting kind of shifty. There's something called the Bates case. So this is James trying to raise extra parliamentary taxation. So what James is doing, this is the Bates cases in 1606. John Bate didn't want to pay taxes on his red currants. Does anyone know what red currants are? I mean, like someone that actually knows the answer, because I don't. Go for it.
It's like a berry.
Okay, great. So John Bate is importing berries, red currants, from Turkey, right? So John Bate is importing red currants, and he says that he doesn't want to. He says that he doesn't have to pay an import duty on these red currants, right? He says that he doesn't have to pay this tax. This was a tax that James I was levying on red currants, right? For whatever reason, there's money in red currants and all of this sort of thing. And John Bates says, I don't have to pay taxes on this, right? Well, they go to court. And the court hears the case. This is called Bates' case. It's a rather famous one in English constitutional history. And it happens in 1606. So the court hears the case, right? And the court rules in James's favor, right? The court says that the king now has the power or the authority to tax imports, right? James Bate is trying to import red currants, and because of Bates' case, it says, the court says that James can now tax this stuff. Now, if you look at the court proceedings, what the court didn't want to do was go against James's divine right rule, right? So in other words, James is sort of acting out of the context of how traditionally the monarchy behaved, right? Taxing imports was something that didn't happen. The court hears the case in 1606, and they say, you know what? James has the right to do this. So in other words, the court is sort of rubber stamping what James wants to do. And they do this out of deference for James, right? So in other words, the court favors divine right. Can I move on? Okay, right. Oh, so you also, hold on a second, you also have to consider some of the international context of what's going on, particularly in the later part of James's reign. So the point that I'm trying to make is that James is sort of shifty, right? He's levying taxes that haven't been levied before. His subjects are taking him to court, and the court, out of deference for James, isn't ruling against him. James is knighting people at an extraordinary rate in order to raise revenue. So he's not technically breaking the law, but he is acting outside of how English kings traditionally act. So he's already starting to sort of like ruffle some feathers of his subjects, right? So his subjects are sort of like, oh, the king is acting sort of how kings haven't acted in the past. So it starts to raise some eyebrows. We also have to keep in mind that James's reign coincided with one of the major continental events in the 17th century. And this is the 30 Years' War. So the 30 Years' War is from 1618 to 1648, and we're going to talk about the 1621 Parliament. So James is implicated in the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War is a war that happens in Central Europe from 1618 to 1648, right? So this is a war that happens in Central Europe, and James is sort of caught in the middle of it, right? So James is kind of caught in the middle of the 30 Years' War. So the 30 Years' War starts, so James's daughter, Elizabeth, is married to Frederick of Bohemia, right? So his daughter, Elizabeth, is married to Frederick of Bohemia. Frederick of Bohemia, so this is Bohemia right here, and this is in Central Europe. This is actually called the Holy Roman Empire, is where this is happening. You don't need to know that, but there's a war going on. It's going to last 30 years, and it's happening in Central Europe. James's daughter and her husband, Frederick, they get overthrown. Now, Frederick is actually sort of like an important person. He's an important person because he is an elector inside the Holy Roman Empire. So you're like, Dr. Petrakis, what the heck is the Holy Roman Empire? The Holy Roman Empire is just like a conglomeration of all of these different principalities, right? So there's a bunch of principalities inside the Holy Roman Empire, and each one of these princes is an elector. And you're like, oh, so there are these princes inside the Holy Roman Empire, and some of these princes are electors. Frederick of Bohemia, the husband of James's daughter Elizabeth, is one of these electors. And what these electors do is they elect, all of these princes inside the Holy Roman Empire, they get together and they elect who is the Holy Roman Emperor, right? So Frederick is a pretty important guy. He's an elector, and he's one of those important princes that gets to cast a vote for who is going to be the Holy Roman Emperor, right? So James is going to get caught in all of the Middle East, right? So they're overthrown in 1618 by the Spanish Habsburgs. Elizabeth and Frederick in Bohemia, this is one of the very few Protestant outposts in Central Europe, right? So this is Elizabeth and Frederick of Bohemia. It's very rare because in the 17th century, Catholics begin to reclaim ground that was taken by Protestants, right? So this is one of the very few places left in Central Europe that is still Protestant, right? So this is an important component of the story. So it's like these the Spanish Habsburgs. The Habsburgs are, of course, the most powerful family. The Habsburgs are the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, and they're Roman Catholic. So what it looks like on the continent in Central Europe is that Roman Catholicism is going to steamroller all over Protestantism on the continent, right? So it looks like Protestantism is over on the continent. James's daughter and her husband Frederick have been overthrown by the forces of satanic darkness. That's what's going on, okay? So it's like, this is going to play out in English politics. I don't personally think it's the forces of satanic darkness, but this is how parliamentarians are going to see it. So this is sort of a big deal. So Parliament starts giving worldview, satanic darkness. I think of how Puritans thought about Catholicism sort of in the same way that Americans thought of communism back during the Cold War. And I'm serious, this is a good analogy, that any sort of gain for communism was a loss for capitalism, right? It's the same thing in 17th century Europe. One gain for Catholicism is a loss for Protestantism. This is what we call the zero-sum game, right? One gain for the Catholics is a loss for the Protestants. This is how they see it. They see it, much like Americans see communism, in apocalyptic terms, right? So this is very dramatic, how they see this. What they see this as, what Protestants see this as, is the extirpation, the complete rooting out of Protestantism on the continent. They see this as a victory for the forces of Satan. That is how they see it, right? So there's an apocalyptic overtone to all of this going on in the 17th century. So Parliament, like you have I was going to say the Taliban, the Puritans are absolutely out of their mind because the Puritans think that the English can take on the Spanish Habsburgs. The Spanish Habsburgs, the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, they own, so I'm going to talk to you just for a second about how powerful these Habsburgs are. The Habsburg family is not only in control of Central Europe, right? So they're the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. But there's also the Habsburgs that own all of Spain, right? So they own Central Europe, they own all of Spain. Oh, by the way, they own all of the New World except for Brazil, right? So this is an extraordinarily powerful family that owns that were literally the most powerful people to ever live up until the 17th century, right? So this is the most powerful family that's ever lived. Think of if you're a Protestant, think of this as Darth Vader and the Emperor and all of this, the Death Star and all of this, because that's how they see it. Okay, so Parliament, filled with all of these Puritans, are sort of like, we're going to give you 300,000 pounds to fight a war on the continent. The Protestants, the Puritans in Parliament, are absolutely out of their mind to think that a measly 300,000 pounds is going to do anything to roll back the forces of Roman Catholicism on the continent. They're crazy. They're out of their mind. There's no way that this is going to happen. So they give James this money by Parliament, and James promises them a war. James is like, okay, I'm gonna take this money and we're gonna fight a war. James is actually really smart because James is seeing himself as the king peacemaker. And that's how he saw himself. He knows that not only is he gonna lose, but he is gonna lose big, right? So all of this is happening. They're giving him money within the context of James needing to shore up his finances, right? James's monarchy is going broke. And here's Parliament giving him money to fight a war. James is like, it would be suicide to think that he could defeat the Habsburg family. So what he does is he just takes the 300,000 and decides not to fight a war, right? So he's just like, I'm taking your money, too bad for you guys and all of this, right? So then Parliament, so things are going to get a little bit out of hand. Parliament then gives him another $300,000, but no war. Right? And so historians have given James a hard time about this, right? And they say that James has taken their money and that this is unconstitutional and all of that sort of thing. I tend to have a lot of sympathy for James, right? Because James knows. James is not stupid. In fact, James is like the closest thing to the philosopher king, like Plato's philosopher king, that we have in the early modern period. The guy is truly an intellectual. And he knows beyond a shadow of a doubt, if he commits any English troops to the continent, they're not going to only lose, but they're going to lose spectacularly. So even though James is taking money from Parliament and not sort of living up to his promises, the fact of the matter is that this is the best possible outcome that James could have asked for, right? Because he's taking money to shore up his monarchy, and he's not losing thousands and thousands of his own troops right? Just putting them into harm's way. So it's within this context, right? So the Spanish Habsburgs are rolling over Protestantism in Central Europe. And it's at this point that we have like one of the more extraordinary events, oh God, in English history. So what James is doing is he's negotiating, right? James is negotiating like he always does, talking with Parliament, figuring out what he can do without committing English soldiers to this war. So he's negotiating. So Parliament is clamoring for war with the Spanish Habsburgs, right? Parliament, the Puritans in Parliament are making these ridiculous claims. Maybe not ridiculous, they believe them. But what they're saying in Parliament is like, God is on our side. God, the providence of God will not let us lose this war. And James is like, oh yes, God is going to let us lose this war. Because if he commits any soldiers, they're going to lose big. So it's at this point in time that Charles, the soon-to-be king, Charles and the Duke of Buckingham get together. Right? Not get together like the way you're thinking, but they get together and they hatch a plan. They hatch a plan. They decide to go to Spain. So rather than wage war against the Spanish Habsburgs, they go to Spain to woo the Spanish Infanta to marry Charles I. Right? So Parliament is saying that we want war. And here's Charles and Buckingham going to Spain, who they should be, according to Parliament, should be fighting, instead to woo the Spanish princess to marry Charles, right? Does everyone understand that? So Charles and Buckingham go to Spain to woo the Spanish Infanta and into marrying Charles. Charles's idea here is that if he marries the Spanish Infanta, it will end the war on the continent. That's what Charles thinks. So he and Buckingham are like, okay, fine, we're going to go to Spain, and the Spanish Infanta is going to marry. This is their plan. Now, Charles, like his father, is very much a believer in divine right. Charles is absolutely outraged. He's absolutely outraged that Parliament is debating what the king should do in public, right? Because Charles, this divine right ruler, believes that Parliament is completely in the wrong. Parliament is saying that we're going to give you money, but then Parliament should dictate how the king should behave. And Charles, growing up with all of this divine right rhetoric and all of that, is absolutely outraged. So Charles is like, you know what, Buckingham and I are going to go to Spain, and we're just going to figure this out for ourselves, right? Okay, so Charles and Buckingham travel incognito. They go in disguise. They leave secretly to go to Spain. There's stories of fake beards, and they sneak out of England because, of course, they sneak out of England to go to Spain. And of course they sneak out of England because the vast majority of English people want a war with Spain. And here Buckingham and Charles are advocating for a marriage between England and Spain, right? So this is totally crazy. So they're famously wearing beards. They wear special wigs in order to disguise their appearance, all of that sort of thing. This is the day and age in which the first newspapers start to develop, right? And of course, newspapers and English language newspapers first started out in the context of the 30 Years' War, reporting on issues of what's going on in the continent and all of that sort of thing. So this is a day and age of newspapers, right? Well, and news gets out, right? News gets out that Buckingham and Charles left England to go to Spain for a Spanish marriage. This is called the Spanish Match, right? And within weeks, everyone hears about it. Everyone knows what's going on. What happens when they get to Spain, or when they get to Madrid, is that they're terribly outclassed, right? So they're terribly outclassed when they get to Spain. Their beards fall off. They go to the Spanish court and they look like a bunch of country bumpkins, all of that sort of thing. They look like a bunch of bumpkins to the cultured and the sophisticated Spanish. So Charles and Buckingham, they go to the Spanish court, and the Spanish, they start making demands on Charles. They start saying to Charles that Catholicism be tolerated in England, right? right? So this is outrageous. There's no way that the English governing classes are going to allow for Roman Catholicism to be tolerated. Of course, Spain is a thoroughly Spanish country. Spain is a thoroughly Spanish. Spain is a thoroughly Catholic country. Of course, they're thoroughly Catholic. They demand that Catholicism be tolerated, and they demand that the Queen have her own chapel and priests and Jesuits at the English court. Right, so the Spanish, this is what we might term high shenanigans going on. Right, there's no way that this would be tolerable to the English governing classes. They believe that Catholicism is diabolical. And here the Spanish are saying, sure, you can marry the Spanish infanta, but you have to tolerate Roman Catholicism, and there has to be priests and Jesuits at the English court. So this is outrageous, right? There has to be daily mass, the Spanish say, at the English court. Eventually, Charles and Buckingham get thrown out of the Spanish court in Madrid. Buckingham, so they're at the Spanish court, being terribly outclassed. The Spanish are making these extraordinary demands if Charles is to marry the Spanish infanta. And Buckingham makes a pass at a Spanish nobleman's wife at court while they're there, right? So they get thrown out, right? So they're like, so Buckingham's making passes at married women, their beards are falling off on the way to Spain. The Spanish make these outrageous demands if Charles is actually going to marry the Spanish infanta. And then Buckingham, of course, is making passes at married men's wives at court and gets thrown out. So Charles and Buckingham leave Spain in absolute embarrassment, right? It's like, I don't even know what they would talk about on the way home, right? It's just like, oh my God, we were such losers. Right? Total losers. So anyway, so they leave Spain in complete shame. But the reception that they receive in England, so they come back from Spain like totally dejected, and Buckingham probably got beat up pretty good and all of this sort of thing. But they come back to England and they receive a hero's welcome. So they come back to England and they receive a hero's welcome. Buckingham and Charles spin the whole experience, right? So it's like things went terribly in Spain, but they put a spin on it, right? This is the early age of newspapers and all of this. They say that they are protectors of Protestantism because they stood up to these demands of the Spanish, right? The Spanish were saying we need Jesuits and daily mass and all of that sort of thing. Charles comes back to England and says, no, we are the protectors of Protestantism. We told the Spanish that we didn't want any part of that. So there's two effects of the Spanish marriage, right? The first one is that Buckingham, through this whole experience, it's just sort of one of those things like where you have a really bad experience with a friend, and that really bad experience sort of like bonds you guys together. That's exactly what happens to Charles and Buckingham. They were sort of like, they become besties, okay, after the whole Spanish experience. It's sort of like they're tight. They're tight after all of this. So they forge a relationship after going to Spain. Charles and Buckingham are also wildly popular, right? So they become good friends. And when they return to England, they become wildly popular. I make this point because Charles is eventually going to be executed because how much he's hated by his subjects. So right here is the very height of Charles I's popularity with the English people, right? And of course he's wildly popular because he didn't break down in negotiations for the Spanish match. He says, oh, I'm a protector of Protestantism, when in fact he's not, and that'll be clear in just a little bit. This is the first and the last time either Charles or the Duke of Buckingham are going to be popular. Okay, this is the height. So let's talk just a little bit about Charles I, right? So I brought Kleenex in case anyone's going to get emotional, but James dies. I'm sorry. He dies in 1625, and his son Charles comes to the throne. So Charles comes to the throne in 1625. Charles, and we know from like our Kishlansky reading, right? So Charles's reign is being revised by historians. So recently, historians are coming to see Charles in a new light. But by seen as probably the worst king in English history, right? So even though modern day historians are sort of trying to revise the historical interpretation of Charles, it's sort of really hard to do because the evidence is more or less surmounting that Charles is not a good king. In fact, you could say, and I hate to say this, cast aspersions on people like this, but he's kind of stupid, right? Where James was intelligent, his father was intelligent, he was savvy, all of that. Charles is stubborn and pig-headed. It's just hard to get around. So he's known as the worst king in English history, and the only one to get his head cut off. One of Charles's sons, who's going to be James II, is another terrible king, but is at least going to be smart enough to leave England before his subjects kill him, right? So it's like Charles wasn't that smart, to give you some indication. So anyway, Charles believes he is very much a divine right king. So this is one of Charles's downfalls. So like, whereas James I was in the true law of free monarchy, put forward a very clear vision of his power, right? And of course, he's all powerful. But what I was trying to get across in class is that the other half of the document qualifies that power, right? That he's the father to his children and has to obey the laws and all of this sort of stuff. Charles doesn't really believe, you ready for it, in the other half of that, right? Charles is stubborn and truly takes to heart this rhetoric, this idea of divinely sanctioned monarchy, right? So Charles is very much a divine right king, right? Another one of Charles's, maybe not a problem, but he doesn't live up to expectations of the monarchy, right? So I guess you can think, this just occurred to me, that Charles is sort of like Napoleon without the Napoleon complex. I guess this is a good idea. Do we know what the Napoleon complex is? What's the Napoleon complex? Oh, in the back, Miles, go for it. And so? Okay, great. So you're short, so you need to make up for it by being like a tyrant, right? Or projecting this vision of yourself as very strong, right? And this is the Napoleon complex. Napoleon was like 5'3", and like he had to project this masculinity in order to make up for his supposed shortness. So Charles, you can think of like Napoleon, but without the Napoleon complex part, right? So he's short, but he's also very weak, right? So his subjects don't respect him very much, right? It's sort of like he projects this air, or he believes in these highfalutin claims of monarchy, but he's a very timid man. And his subjects will always talk about how he stutters, and how he's short, and how he's very shy. So he came off to his subjects as this authoritarian, right? But also personally, also a very weak and timid person. So this just draws the absolute hatred of his people. They're like, oh, he's this tyrant, but you meet the guy, and there's not much there, right? So this, he appears to be, as his contemporaries said, he appears to be aloof, right? Not really caring about, like, his subjects or anything like that. He appears to be aloof. Okay. So it's 1625. So the year that Charles I comes to the throne, it's 1625. And he calls Parliament, right? So he calls Parliament in 1625. And in 1625, Charles is relatively popular, right? So Charles, the first thing that he does when he comes to office, his father dies, he calls Parliament. And there's a realization in 1625 that the forces of Protestantism during the 30 Years' War, that it's pretty much a lost cause, right? So it's realized by 1625 that, revenging the losses of James's daughter Elizabeth and Frederick, that they're sort of like, that it's gone and that there's nothing they can do about it, right? So by 1625, it's sort of like, oh, the forces of Catholicism are taking over on the continent. But Parliament is still clamoring for war against Spain, right? So Parliament is still clamoring for war, right? So Parliament's like, oh, we want war. So what Charles and Buckingham do is they change their tactic. They change their strategy, right? And what Charles and Buckingham do is they say that they will not commit England to a ground war, right? So they're not going to commit soldiers, but they're going to advocate for something called, are you ready for it? So no soldiers, but they're going to advocate for something called a blue water policy, right? They're advocating for a blue water policy. And you're like, Dr. Petrakis, what are you talking about, a blue water policy? I'll tell you what a blue water policy is. It means taking Spain and the Spanish Habsburgs, that they're going to take them on the high seas, right? So they're going to fight the war through the English Navy, right? What Charles is talking about to his Parliament is he's evoking like the golden age of English navigation. In Parliament, he's talking about, oh, we're going to relive the greatness, are you ready for it, of Sir Walter Raleigh, right? So he starts evoking the Elizabethan period and Sir Walter Raleigh taking on the Spanish on the high seas, right? So this is what Charles is talking about. He's talking about fighting for nothing less than the defense of Protestants, right? So he's appealing to Parliament sort of pro-Protestant foreign policy. The idea here is to have this blue water policy and start having smashing successes on the high sea. So what Charles and Buckingham want to do is defeat the forces of diabolical Catholicism, not on the continent, but on the high seas, right? This is about destroying Spanish shipping and all of that sort of thing, right? This is their blue water policy. So the first thing that they do, oh no, not yet. The first thing that they do is they have something called the Cadiz expedition, right? This is their first foray of this blue water policy. So it's disastrous. I'll just tell you up front, it's disastrous. Buckingham becomes the Admiral of the Navy. He has never been on a ship before, right? He becomes the Admiral of the Navy. It's nice to have buddies in high places. And decides to take on the Spanish Silver Fleet, right? So the idea here is to take on the Spanish Habsburgs on the high seas. And the Cadiz expedition is the first colossal failure. First of all, so Buckingham's like, okay, we're going to take on the Spanish on the high seas. We're going to destroy Spanish shipping and therefore undermine the power of the Catholic Colossus. And it's a complete disaster. Total disaster in the sense that they are using ships that are over 50 years old. The sails on these ships were the same sails that the English Navy used in 1588. You ready for it? Against the Spanish Armada. Right, so they're using sails that are totally old and outdated. And it's with these old and crappy ships or whatever that they're trying to take on the most powerful ruling family that the world has ever known up to this point, right? So it's completely and almost hopelessly idiotic what they're doing. So the ships are not outfitted. They're using the same sails and the same ships that were used in 1588. And there were also really poor provisions. A lot of the food on the ships, they didn't they didn't have canning and like mason jars like they do today. A lot of the food was spoiled. The soldiers ate it. And about 1/4 of the English Navy on the Cadiz expedition died of food poisoning. Okay, so this is a complete and utter disaster. So what they do next, it gets worse. Buckingham is like, okay, what we need to do is so the next idea is that what they want to do is give the French, so the plan is to give the French some English ships so that the French can fight the Spanish on the high seas, right? You have to keep in mind that the French during the 1620s and the 1630s, that they too are a Catholic power. right? So the English are giving ships and provisions and all of that sort of thing to France, and the king of France at the time is Louis the 13th. So Louis the 13th is the king of France. So he's giving the French all of these provisions to fight the Spanish. What the French king does, so instead of fighting the Spanish on the high seas like the French promised, what they do is so the French take those English ships, right, and those English provisions. What the French do with them is they have a siege at La Rochelle. And you're like, so what, Petrarchus? What's the big deal? Why can't Louis the 13th besiege La Rochelle? Well, La Rochelle was one of the very few Protestant outposts in France, right? So what this is that this is English ships and English provisions being used against Protestants in France, right? Again, a complete and utter disaster. Cardinal Richelieu is the Prime Minister of France, and he personally oversaw the destruction of this Protestant community, right? So this is complete ineptitude. Not only did so when the French besieged La Rochelle, they essentially killed all of the Protestants there. So this was a horrific loss for Protestantism on the continent. So, Parliament is of course outraged at all of this, right? Particularly the siege at La Rochelle, because Parliament is trying to fund a war against international Catholicism. And here you have those funds being used for the destruction of Protestantism on the continent, right? So it's a complete disaster. So just after the La Rochelle disaster, Parliament meets, right? So you can only imagine how upset Parliament is after the La Rochelle disaster. So what Parliament starts to demand some things, right? First of all, they make a lot of demands. Parliament says that the king has to get rid of the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham has to go. They're like, I don't know what you're doing, but this guy clearly sucks at his job, right? He's not only losing battles, but he's doing it through complete ineptitude, right? So Charles is really upset, but he doesn't give in to Parliament's demands. He's like, he believes himself to be a divine right ruler, and he says, I'm keeping Buckingham. So what he does is he dissolves Parliament. He tells Parliament to go home. He says, you guys, I've heard enough of you and your demands and all of this. Get the hell out. So then what he does is he says, he still needs money. He's being a complete failure. So he's thinking to himself, he's calling Parliament because he needs subsidies, right? He's clearly losing this war on behalf of Protestantism on the continent. Not only is he losing this war, but in the case of La Rochelle, he's actually contributing to the downfall of Protestantism on the continent, right? So Charles keeps butting up with his parliament. He keeps butting heads with his parliament because he needs to raise revenue, right? The monarchy is essentially going broke. He engages in what we might call these cockamamie plans with the Navy and the Duke of Buckingham and all that. But he still needs money. So Charles is thinking okay, so how can I raise funds without calling Parliament, right? So he starts thinking about my monarchy is going bankrupt, my military strategy is horrific, right? But he still needs money. So what he does is he embarks on a really crazy plan of forcing his nobles to pay him money. This is called the forced loan, right? So now he's starting to, this is tyranny, okay? So he's taking money from his parliament. Parliament is saying you need to defend Protestantism. Charles is engaging in wars with the Spanish and the French. The French are killing Protestants because of English incompetence, right? And now Charles is forcing his nobles to pay him a loan. This is called the forced loan. So the forced loan is actually an enormous success for Charles. It brings in almost £250,000, right? £250,000 it brings in. So it's a financial financial success for Charles, but it's a political catastrophe for Charles. So what happens, there's this, so he's forcing his nobles to pay him loans, and this group of nobles called the Five Knights. The Five Knights refuse to pay, right? So the Five Knights refuse to pay, and they raise a legal question, right? So this is English constitutional history. Five Knights tell Charles, we're not going to pay, right? So Charles is, these Five Knights say, we're not going to pay. And what they do is they raise a legal question. So these Five Knights are saying, we're not going to pay you, Charles. You have no legal basis to make me pay you a forced loan, right? So they raise a legal question. And the legal question that they're asking, so you ready for it? This is important. They ask, can the king tax without his subjects' consent, right? So can the king arbitrarily tax his people? Can he tax without their consent? So that's one question. So can the king tax without his subjects' consent? And are you ready for it? Can the king imprison his subjects without due cause? Charles, when his nobles weren't paying, the Five Knights, when they refused to pay Charles the forced loan, right? So Charles is saying, all y'all guys, he doesn't say all y'all guys, did you get it? He says, all y'all guys need to pay me this forced loan, or else I'm going to put you in prison, right? And that's what Charles does, right? If you don't pay Charles this forced loan, he's going to put you in prison. So these Five Knights raise a legal issue before the English courts. They're asking questions like, can the king tax without the consent of Parliament? And they're asking questions like, can the king imprison his subjects without due cause? So these two questions that the Five Knights case brings about are some of the cornerstones of what we might consider constitutional liberty, right? Like, does the monarch, by virtue of divine right, have the authority to take his subjects' property without their consent? Right, so this is a very central constitutional issue that they're working out in the context of the 17th century. They're asking about, does the king have the right to imprison his subjects without due cause? Right, so these are very central questions to the democracy in which we live today, right? And they're working this out in the context of the 17th century. So like I said, these Five Knights refuse to pay the forced loans. And Charles throws them in jail indefinitely. Charles is saying, you don't pay me the forced loan. If you don't give me your property, I'm going to put you in prison for the rest of your natural life. You are going to die in some horrific dungeon somewhere in the middle of nowhere. This is what Charles is doing. The court actually declines to hear the case, right? So they're still working out these issues in the context of the 17th century. So the court actually declines to hear the case. And they decline to hear it out of deference or respect for Charles I, right? They decline to hear it out of respect for Charles because they realize, the court realizes that what Charles is doing is tyrannical, right? They realize what Charles is doing is completely against the English common law. English constitutional tradition says that the king cannot do this. But because he is theoretically a divine right king, the court says we're just not going to touch this case, right? Out of deference to Charles and his divine right rule, we're not going to hear the case, right? So what we're doing is we're sort of getting into the causes of the English Revolution. So there's another expedition. Actually, I'm not going to tell you about it. Oh wait, I'm going to tell you. It's time to go home. All right, so it's, what time is it? It's 12:06. Why don't we take, my friends, it's 12:06. Why don't we take a couple minutes break? Let's take 5 minutes, take a break, and then we're going to come back. We're going to take attendance, and then we're going to move on to our okay. Hey, how's it going, man? I've been institutionalized like way longer than you guys have, so I sort of know how this plays out. And it's just really important that everybody just comes to class. So I'm gonna take attendance like at different times, every class and whatever. And the only reason why I do that is because it's just gonna make things go easier if everyone comes to class and doesn't, play these games where it's like you click in and then run out and then, like, oh my God. So there's that. So just right now it's open. So if you just click in, if you just press the A button, affirm your attendance in 101. It's like we're taking oaths here, and there are no conscientious objectors in our class. So just make sure that you press the A button, and I'll leave it open, right? So you can just click in. Did everyone click in? Let me see. Oh my goodness. All right. I think there's a way for me to check. Okay, let's see. Can you guys see that? Oh, you can't see that. Everyone, I've got 226 people that have clicked in. One person pressed the wrong button. I know. At any time you ask anyone to do anything, there's going to be one person that screws it up. Oh, one person pressed C, 2 people pressed C. Just stop with the madness, okay? I mean, for the love of God, guys, it's A, B, or C. Just make sure. Someone's pressing E now. There's 7, 8, 9 people that are pressing. You know what? All right. So 11 people, 12. Now you're doing it to mess with me. Okay. So all right. So make sure. Oh my God. Just press A. Just press. And everyone, can we agree? Do we need to say it as a class?
Please press A.
Okay. Good. All right. Still. Oh, good. Now there's people that are redoing their. All right. This is good. All right. Not E. Not C. Okay. One person, 2 people for B. Oh, all right, so that's not 2. So I'm gonna move on from this. I'm new with this technology. All right, so so it's 1627. And Charles, there's something about Charles. It's that he's like, he's like both stupid and stubborn, right? And this is a problem in history, right? Especially for Charles. Poor Charles. It must be tough to be him. So anyway, he devises another expedition, right? So it's like they've all been complete and utter catastrophes, and he's like, we're going to try another expedition on the high seas, and this is called the Re-Expedition, right? This is the Re-Expedition. This is 1627, and so at this time in history, England is already at war with Spain, right? And like I said, Spain and the Spanish Habsburgs are the most powerful people that the world has ever seen. The Spanish Habsburgs are more powerful than the Roman Empire ever was. The Habsburgs are more powerful than the Abbasid Caliphate. They're more powerful than the Greeks in the age of like the high seas and all of this sort of thing. So it's like, so they're fighting a battle that they cannot win. There's no way that the English are going to take on the Spanish Habsburgs. And they're basically fighting the Spanish Habsburgs with one arm tied behind their back. So it's at this point in 1627 that Charles and Buckingham, in their absolute and infinite wisdom, are like, we're fighting the Spanish Habsburgs, the most powerful people to have ever lived. Why don't we also not only fight the Spanish, but let's get in a war with the French at the same time, right? So they decide to go to war with both the Spanish Habsburgs and the French. This happens in 1627. So here Buckingham, I wish I was a fly on the wall. Buckingham concocts a plan to get all of the disaffected French Protestants. He gets all of those French Protestants in France, like in the same place. He's like, we need to get the disaffected French Protestants living in France. We'll get like the 7 or 8 Protestant nobles in France. We'll all get them together, right? We'll all get them together. And the plan is to overthrow the Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu is the prime minister to the King of France. This is the King of France is Louis XIII, and this is Cardinal Richelieu. Buckingham's idea is sort of like, what we're going to do is we're going to get all of those people that are dissatisfied, those Protestants that are dissatisfied with France, inside of France, and we're going to sort of like give them money and give them funds to overthrow and assassinate Cardinal Richelieu. Right? This is like this also goes back to like the United States. This is exactly the sort of thing that the United States would. It's like back in the Cold War or whatever, the United States would fund groups to overthrow communist regimes, right? And it's the same thing that the English want to do. You know, like they supported the Contras during the Civil War in Nicaragua. They supported the United States supported the Taliban under the communist regime in the 1980s. So it's this is something that resonates with me. It's a totally stupid idea and it never works out. But the idea here is to fund the disaffected French Protestants in France, give them money, give them arms, all of that sort of thing, to overthrow Cardinal Richelieu and the Catholic faction at the King's Court, right? This is what they decide to do. So it never works out. It's a complete full-on catastrophe for the English Protestants and the French Protestants and the Americans in the 20th century. And it's a total disaster. What Buckingham proposes to do is to give money and arms to those dissatisfied French Protestants living in France, but also to fund like an English armada, a bunch of English Navy ships, to sail to France and help them overthrow the French monarchy, right? So it is, of course, a complete disaster. The English lose about 4,000 men out of a force of 7,000, right? So they lose over half their men, the English sailing to France, right? So they lose 4,000 out of 7,000 people. Buckingham is credited with the staggering defeat, primarily because it was ill-conceived, right? So what Buckingham is credited with this defeat, because the idea was, is you're going to fund all of these Protestants in France to overthrow the monarchy, the English Navy is going to sail in and invade France and affect this political change. Well, what Buckingham does is, you know, he's stupid. We should feel sorry for him, really. So this is where they land. This is the siege at Saint Martin de Ré. This is in 1627, and the English, he didn't provide the English sailors with ladders long enough in order to scale the walls of the fort, right? So this is a complete disaster, right? And it's a disaster primarily because of Buckingham's incompetence. So this is the Ree disaster. Charles is desperate for money at this point, right? There's all of these failed expeditions are costing the English crown an absolute fortune. Buckingham is screwing things up on like a world historical level here, right? And Charles is still in need of money. So Parliament again meets in this context, right? It's 1628. After the expedition at Ré is a complete and utter disaster. 4,000 out of 7,000 troops are killed, primarily because Buckingham didn't outfit the ships with long enough ladders to scale the fortress walls, right? So Parliament meets in this context. The Protestants in France are being slaughtered. They're losing Central Europe to the forces of Roman Catholicism, right? And Parliament meets. And it's within this context that Parliament produces one of the most important documents, not just in English history, but I would say that the Petition of Right is one of those really important constitutional documents that sort of defines Western civilization, right? So we're talking about like a cornerstone of English constitutionalism in the 17th century, right? So this is what happens, right? So Parliament is meeting in this context, and they pen something called the Petition of Right. And it's couched in the language of deference, right? So if you read the Petition of Right, it's actually, Parliament is very respectful in their message to the king. It's couched in this language of deference, like, oh, my liege, your suffering subjects love you so much, sort of stuff, right? So it's couched in the language of deference, right? But they make some extraordinary claims. So they start saying, so this is important, they start saying that no person has to pay a tax without the consent of Parliament, right? So this is about no tax. The Americans are going to say this. John Dickinson, in one of his famous pamphlets, A Letter of a Pennsylvania Farmer, in the 1770s is going to say no taxation without representation, right? This is exactly what the parliamentarians are saying in 1628. In other words, like this is a philosophical point that they're making, is that the king doesn't have the right to their property, right? The king can't take their property without laws being created by the people's representatives in parliament, right? So this is a very philosophical question that they're answering, right? They also start saying other things. They say no person can be imprisoned without just cause. So in other words, like the stuff that's going on in the petition of right is basically everything that we take for granted. What they're establishing here is habeas corpus rights. That the king doesn't have power, the executive doesn't have power to deprive people of their liberty without breaking the law, right? So like in order to go to jail, you have to break the law, right? This is what the precedent that they're setting in the petition of right, right? So habeas corpus rights. So there's two other things. The petition of right says that soldiers can't be put in people's houses. Soldiers can't be put in people's homes without their consent. This is important because if you weren't paying Charles the Fourth's loan, what Charles would do is he'd put like a platoon of soldiers in your house, right? Can you imagine? This is a sort of tyranny, a level of tyranny that we're talking about, right? And this is one of the things that led the Americans to declare independence against Great Britain, right? This is one of the reasons why I'm bringing up America and all of this sort of thing. Is that like what the king was doing is putting soldiers in your house if you didn't give them money, right? So this is something that the petition of right is against. They also say, the petition of right also says that no citizen can be subject to martial law. Right, so in other words, according to martial law, if you steal something and you're a soldier, under martial law, you can be executed for that. So citizens under Charles I were like, there were petty crimes happening. And what Charles would do would say, oh, you're going against the king? Well, we're going to subject you to martial law, and now we're going to kill you, right? So the petition of right is a document that's written by Parliament to sort of counteract some of the things that Charles is trying to do, right? They want to say that Charles cannot act against the law. So there's a whole litany of grievances against Charles I. So what we've been talking about so far are sort of like, you can put this in the context of constitutional grievances against Charles, right? That's what we've been talking about so far. What I want to talk about now is I want to talk a little bit about the religious grievances against Charles I. Because in a lot of ways, I've only told you half the story, right? The petition of right in 1628 isn't going to go into effect. It's going to go in effect later on in English history, and we'll talk about that. The point is that they make a clear and obvious statement, right? That they're setting a precedent that the king can't do whatever he wants, right? It's not going to go into law in 1628, but it's going to come to be one of the cornerstones of English constitution, right? It doesn't happen in 1628. They're going to fight a war over it. They're going to kill the king over it, and then these ideas are going to come to the fore, right? But this is the first volley. You can think of the petition of right in 1628 as sort of like the first volley against Charles I. Things are really, it's almost like the constitutional issues are one thing, but like what really, excuse my French, pisses off his subjects is the religious stuff, and that's what we're going to talk about now, right? So we've talked about some of the constitutional stuff, now we're going to talk about the religious stuff. So new line in your notes, we're shifting gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the religious aspects to all of this. So James we know that Charles's father, James, sort of met religious problems head on. James is an intellectual, James is smart, James is articulate, and he wanted to confront these things head on, right? Charles is much different. Charles just sort of does things, but doesn't explain to anyone why, in fact, he's doing it, right? So it's sort of like, this is where Charles gets a hard time for being aloof, because he'll make fundamental changes to the English church, but he won't explain like why he's doing it. What's going to happen is Charles's subjects are going to come to believe that Charles is an agent of the Popish Antichrist, is what's going to happen, right? So this is the story that I'm about to tell you. It's almost like in the scheme of things, like constitutional issues, like 20%, religious issues, 80% for the causes of the war. This is the stuff, I know it's like we're going to cover it briefly, but this is the stuff that people at the time actually cared about. So Charles just sort of goes ahead and makes extraordinary changes to the English church, right? One of the things that like the Puritans particularly hate about Charles, let's go back, is this. Oh, not this guy, not that guy. This guy. So Charles, this is William Laud. And William Laud is the brains, or the lack of brains, however you think about it, of Charles's religious policy. So William Laud, under Charles, becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, under Charles. So William Laud is going to be like the brains behind the religious changes going on in England under Charles. Right? So this is the brains behind it all. Laud is going to be executed. They're going to kill, and Charles is going to sign the death warrant, much against his will, probably in some sense trying to save his own life. So Archbishop Laud is going to be executed in 1645. So this is the Archbishop of Canterbury under Charles I, and the Puritans and the Protestants in England are going to hate him. Not just hate him, but there's like a murderous hatred against Archbishop Laud. Actually, it's known that he was actually a really nice guy. It's sad, really, but anyway. So Archbishop Laud first got his start under James I. So under Charles's father, Archbishop Laud was there and all of that sort of thing. Archbishop Laud was a cleric under James I. Archbishop Laud is a brilliant theologian. I know I said he was stupid, but he's a brilliant theologian. Now he adheres to a particular kind of Protestantism. This is where things, so if you're taking notes, this is going to be a key part of what I'm telling you. So he's not Catholic. Okay, so let's just say that. He's not Catholic. He adheres to a kind of Protestantism called, are you ready for it? I'll spell it for you. It's called Arminianism. I'll spell it. This is Arminianism. I bet you can't spell, A-R-M-I-N. So James is smart. James knows that Arminianism is trouble. James is like, so I turned off the thing. Okay. So James knows that Arminianism is trouble, and James refuses to give advancement to Archbishop Laud. James knows that this guy's religious ideas, while he's brilliant, that this dude is trouble. So James doesn't give him preferment, right? Under Charles, so where James is smart, Charles is a moron. He gives Laud the most important religious position inside the Church of England. This is the Archbishopric of Canterbury. He's the closest religious advisor to the king. So where James I knew that this guy's trouble, that this Arminianism stuff is trouble, Charles I makes him the most powerful cleric in all of the Church of England, right below the king. So the question is, you're like, Dr. Petrakis, okay, Arminianism, I can't even spell it, I don't know what you're talking about. Why do the Protestants, and particularly the Puritans, why do they find this so problematic? So Arminianism, at its very core, is Protestant, right? All of the Protestant ideas, the priesthood of all believers, ideas of predestination, all of that the point is at its very core, Arminianism is Protestant, right? It's first articulated by a Dutchman, bet you can't guess his name, Arminius. It's first articulated by Arminius in the 17th century. He's a Dutchman in the early 17th century. This Arminian theology is developed. So at its core, it's Protestant. It is a Protestant theology. But Arminianism believes, you ready for it? That the Roman Catholic Church, that would be the RCC if you're taking notes, the Roman Catholic Church is the mother of all churches. So it's the mother of all churches, although it's kind of corrupt, right? So the point that I'm trying to make is that in Arminian theology, they do look back kindly to the Roman Catholic Church. This is, by the way, the Romish Antichrist, according to the Puritans. The problem with Charles and Laud is what they do is they try to strictly enforce religious conformity, right? A religious conformity along Arminian lines. So Charles's father, James, is really famous for a phrase that he uses. One of the things that, like when confronted with intractable religious problems, James I would try to muddle through. That's what James said. And it's like, we're not going to confront the logical conclusions of our ideology. We are going to muddle through. That's actually my favorite motto. Right? It's like, we're going to get through this, we're going to muddle through, it's going to be good. So this was sort of how James's position is on religion. He's like, we're going to just muddle through this, guys. He's like, we're going to do this, right? So James was okay, in other words, with religious dissent, so long as people are generally speaking loyal to the king, right? So James is willing to muddle through. He's not going to enforce religious conformity. He's willing to muddle through just as long as everyone says, yes, James, we're loyal to you, whatever, right? Not Charles and Laud. Charles and Laud do not tolerate any religious dissent whatsoever, right? So Charles and Laud are going to have a flirtation with this Arminianism stuff, right? This new theology. They're going to have, I know flirtation probably wasn't the best phrase to use, but they're going to try to implement Arminianism. And then they're not going to tolerate any dissent at all, right? So this is, well, let's see how this plays out. So one of the aspects of Arminianism is that it stresses, are you ready for it? Beautiness and holiness, right? So it stresses beautiness and holiness. In other words, what the Arminians embrace is ceremonialism, right? So in the Arminian theology, they embrace ceremony. They want to bring back the altar, and they want to make the altar the centerpiece of the church, right? So I know we're like, you guys are like, so what? Who cares? What it suggests, right? And so they take this crap seriously in the 17th century. What this suggests is that there are miracles happening at the altar table. So when the priest holds up the bread, in the Protestant church, it's done symbolically. But in the Arminian church, it's done symbolically as well. But it looks very Catholic. It looks like there's miracles happening at the altar. So at the English church, usually in the 17th century, like the altar would be like off over here, and things would be done like ceremonially and all of that. But here in this new church, it's like center stage. It would be like center stage, and it's railed off, and it looks very Catholic. It looks as though miracles are happening at the altar. This is going to rub a lot of Protestants the wrong way because it looks Roman Catholic. Theologically, it's not, but it looks popish, right? So this is one thing. Charles and Laud. So Charles takes this divine right stuff seriously, right? Charles says that it's impossible to immerse yourself in a church if the church is ugly, right? So this is the beautiness and the holiness aspect to all of this. What Charles is saying is that there needs to be ceremony. There needs to be priests that very much look the part as priests, right? This is about giving priests very fancy vestments, giving priests scepters, that sort of thing, making them look like Roman Catholic priests. So Charles believes in this beautiness and holiness aspect of the English church. The Arminians also embrace something called the Old Style, this is the Old Style liturgical calendar, right? So they adopt this new calendar. So in other words, they adopt the old calendar of the Roman Catholic Church. So in other words, according to the Roman Catholic Church, there were like feast days, like holidays, that all Roman Catholics celebrated at the same time. Under Arminianism, they bring that back. They bring back the old Roman Catholic feast day calendar, right? So they're essentially having parties and holidays and that sort of thing at the same time Roman Catholics. So Archbishop Laud and Charles, they also bring back like the old festivities of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, it makes me sort of realize that I should be showing you a picture of what a Puritan looked like. Because if there's one thing that Puritans were the guys in the black hats with the buckle, all black, very stern crowd. They're very stern. They're the most serious people that you'll ever meet, right? Like they're Puritans, for God's sakes. They don't show any emotion, right? Well, to the Puritans, they hate all of this sort of merriment, right? They hate the old style liturgical calendar. They hate bringing back all of the feast days of the Roman Catholic Church because to them this smacks of popery, right? The Puritans are very stern and ascetic and all of that sort of thing. So this is great. So the Puritans are very much against essentially having any fun. I guess is the point that I'm trying to make. And Charles famously reissues something called the Book of Sports. So in other words, under James, like sporting events were sort of like canceled because people should be going to church on Sunday, and James gave in to this, right? James gave in to the Puritans who like didn't want people having fun on the weekends, right? So there's actually a lot of support for Charles. What Charles wants to do is he creates something called the Book of Sports. And what the Book of Sports is it outlines, you can read it on the internet, it outlines the sort of activities that you can have on the weekend, right? So in other words, this isn't in the Book of Sports, but it's sort of like you can play football on the weekend. You can play soccer on the weekend. You can have baseball games on the weekend. The Puritans wanted to get rid of all of that stuff. The Puritans were like, the weekend? What are you talking? Oh, she's leaving, she took an oath. You took an oath? Okay, sorry, it's okay. James is like, under James, he got rid of this, but under Charles, it's sort of like, oh, we can now have fun on the weekends. We can play these certain sports on the weekends, right? So Charles brings back the Book of Sports, much to the chagrin of the Puritans. The Puritans are like, the weekend? They're like, what are you talking about? The weekend is for praying to God. The king here is saying that you can play sports on the weekend? This was ludicrous, right? So Charles brings back the Book of Sports. In Arminianism, the church is filled with music, right? So in the Arminian church, in this church that Charles and Laud are creating, it's filled with music, right? In the Puritan vision of a perfect church, there is no music, right? It's very austere and kind of lifeless and sterile, right? This is all about the individual and God. Nothing about music or ceremony or anything like that. Charles appoints all of the important church positions. He gives the important church positions to Arminians. So he gives all of those important positions within the Church of England. He's going to give to people who believe the same thing that he does. In other words, Charles isn't going to tolerate anyone in the Church of England that deviates from his and Archbishop Laud's view of how the church should be. Okay. I also just want to point out that Charles uses very special courts. These are called the courts of the Star Chamber. And the courts of the Star Chamber is important because he's going to use these courts, the courts of the Star Chamber, to persecute Puritans that don't go along with his Arminian agenda. So for instance, if there's Puritans out there in the countryside or in London that are still adhering to this old version of how you should worship, Charles is going to persecute those Puritans and put them under a special court that's going to throw them in prison for a long, long time. Right? So it's sort of like Charles is making sweeping changes to the church, changes that the Puritans suspect are popish changes to the church. And if anyone disagrees with Charles on issues of the church, they're going to be persecuted in the king's special courts, the Star Chamber, where they're going to sit in prison for a very, very long time. So Parliament's called, and so it's like, okay, so Charles is doing this stuff. Parliament is called in 1629. And this is the last Parliament that's going to sit for 11 years, right? So after 1629, Charles is going to embark on something called the 11 Years' Tyranny. This is what historians call it. Because Charles is going to make these changes to the church, and he's going to stop calling Parliament altogether. It's during this 11 Years' Tyranny, from about 1629 to 1640, this is 1629 to 1640 is the 11 Years' Tyranny. It's during this time that Charles truly tries to rule as an absolute prince, right? As an absolute king. So this is the last Parliament that's going to meet for 11 years. And so there's war with Spain, of course, right? I mean, what else? It's sort of like, what else are you doing? We're fighting the Spanish. There's war with Spain, and he needs money, right? So this, I would like to point out, the 1629 Parliament is also the only Parliament of Charles's reign where like the first course of business is not the impeachment and proposal of executing the Duke of Buckingham, right? So this is the only Parliament where that happens, and you're like, why, Dr. Petrakis, what happened to Buckingham? I brought tissues in case anyone's going to get upset. But Buckingham is assassinated, right? Buckingham is assassinated. A minor aristocrat, like Buckingham, angered a lot of people. Like there's two people that like Buckingham. It was James. I don't even know if his wife liked him. Who knows? But James and Charles like Buckingham. So Buckingham, some minor nobleman, he slights a minor nobleman. It's like, oh, you're not going to sit at my table. Get out of here. So the guy goes. He's like, all right, I'm not going to sit at your table. Whatever, man. He goes and buys a 10-penny knife, so a cheap knife, comes back and slits Buckingham's throat while he's eating. Right. So Buckingham comes to an unillustrious end. There's celebrations throughout London. There's bonfires, there's feasts. The entire city comes together in celebration of the assassination of the Duke of Buckingham. There's universal joy within England that the Duke of Buckingham has been executed or has been assassinated. Right? So there's bonfires throughout the city. Poets start writing poetry, talking about how great the assassin was and all this. You can read it. There's poetry. They write poetry about it. So the major issues of the 1629 Parliament is, of course, the Puritans in Parliament are absolutely livid about the Arminian turn in the English church. Right? So this is the only Parliament where the first order of business isn't imprisoning and killing Buckingham, but the first order of business is calling Charles' attention to all of these changes that are going on within the English church. Right, so that's what's going on here. Charles also realizes that these wars against Spain are causing him a financial hemorrhage. Right, so it's like Parliament is upset about the changes going on in the church, but Charles is still in a position where he needs money from Parliament in order to run his government, right? So what Parliament says is, Parliament essentially says that you need to quit fighting these wars on the continent, right? So Parliament says you need to stop doing that. And believe it or not, Charles actually makes one arguably good decision, and he decides to make peace with both France and Spain, right? So Parliament, he moves to dissolve Parliament. He's going to make peace and all of that sort of thing. He moves to dissolve Parliament. And And when he sends, so like when you dissolve Parliament, do you guys remember when there was like a shooting in Ottawa in the Parliament, and then the sergeant at arms shot the guy dead? Okay, so the sergeant at arms is actually an ancient, very English thing. So so I guess I can relate this to something you remember, is that the sergeant of arms, one of his jobs is to keep Parliament safe, in which the guy in Ottawa certainly did. But it's also when the king in the 17th century wanted to tell Parliament to go home. The sergeant of arms is supposed to knock on it's very ceremonial, right? And the sergeant at arms knocks on the door and tells Parliament, he says, y'all guys, you need to go home. He doesn't say y'all guys, but he says it's time, the king says the Parliament's dissolved. So when the sergeant of arms goes to Parliament's door, right? So Charles is crying himself to sleep at night, the Buckingham's dead and all of this. He sends the sergeant of arms to Parliament to tell them that it's time to go home. So when that happens, Parliament is sitting, right? And they're sitting in Parliament and it's like all of you guys together or whatever. And it's like, you hear the guy knocking at the door and Parliament goes, oh my God, we need to pass 3 resolutions. They're like, he's at the door, he's gonna dissolve Parliament, we need to do 3 things. So Parliament declares in 1629 that anyone paying taxes, they pass 3 resolutions. Anyone paying taxes, anyone collecting taxes. So if you're paying taxes, if you're collecting taxes, anyone intending religious innovation. So anyone making changes to the English church. So they're like, the king's at the door, anyone that's paying taxes, collecting taxes, or intending innovation in the Church of England. You ready for it? If you do those 3 things, you are, and I quote, a capital enemy to the kingdom and the common. So it's like the sergeant at arms is knocking at the door, and it's like, okay, we're in trouble. We need to pass 3 resolutions. They pass those 3 resolutions. So the Parliament is eventually dissolved. The sergeant of arms kicks the door in and all of this sort of thing, and dissolves the Parliament. And the 3 resolutions that they pass become meaningless. But in 1629, there is a full-blown constitutional crisis between the king and his Parliament. Things are going to be so bad between Charles and his Parliament that he's going to quit calling Parliament altogether for 11 years. From 1629 to 1640, Parliament is not going to be called. What period in English history is this referred to as? The 11 years tyranny. Fantastic, right? So this is, and it's at this point in time, in 1629, it's at this point in time that you start to see all of the Puritans coming to America. Because in 1629, you start to see the English people, a diaspora from England to the United States, right? The 13 colonies. Because those Puritans simply cannot live under Charles I. He's a tyrant, he's intending popish innovations in the church, and those diehard Puritans, it's at this point that they start colonizing Massachusetts and Virginia and all of those sorts of places, right? And it's interesting in American history just how Puritanism still plays out. There's sort of church separation of church and state, but it's sort of, and that's the result of the Puritans, right? So this is when the American diaspora starts. It was a tiny trickle under James I, but becomes full-blown after 1629. So the question becomes, right? If Charles isn't going to call Parliament, so then how is he going to raise money, right? So how is he going to do it? He doesn't know, by the way. He intends in 1629 to never call Parliament again, right? He's like, I'm just going to live. He's like, I'm living the dream. I'm going to be an absolutist monarch, all of that sort of thing, right? So the question is how does he raise all of this money? And the policy that he comes to, the policy that he creates, is called the policy of Thorough. So this is an important thing that you should have in your notes. This is the policy of Thorough. This is what they call it. This is what it is. So the policy of thorough is Charles's long-term policy to shore up the finances of England, or to shore up the finances for his monarchy, right? And this is about so what the policy of thorough is. It is about bringing together all of the three crowns of Britain, right? What this is about is the policy of thorough. So this is important. I know it's at the end of the class. I promise to not keep us late. What the policy of thorough is, it's about linking London and England, right, to Scotland, and it's about uniting England to Scotland and to Ireland as well. So this is about centralizing the realm. So this is the policy of thorough, and this is about linking together financially, consolidating power, centralizing power in England, right? So they're going to start making changes in Scotland, and they're going to start making changes in Ireland, right? This is part of a broad trend of something that's going on in the 17th century. In the 17th century, you start to see something across all of European history, and this is like the beginning of the centralization of government, right? So that's what's something going on here, and this is about the centralization of governments in the 17th century. Charles I is simply continuing on a bigger trend of something that's going on throughout Europe at this time. So this is the policy of thorough, and it's about bringing together the three kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. This is about linking the center, London, to the periphery, Scotland and Ireland. This is about centralization of government power. It first starts to happen under Charles I. So the mastermind behind all of this is none other than Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford. And the Earl of Strafford, because we know that Charles I is stupid, the Earl of Strafford is really the brains behind all of this. He lives until 1641, and he too is going to be executed by Parliament when Parliament finally meets. So I'm gonna leave us with that. It's time to go. All right, awesome. I look forward to finishing up our discussion of English history next week. Next week I will talk to you guys more about the exam and all of that sort of CRAP. And I know you guys are going to be freaked out and whatever, but it's going to be okay. We're going to muddle through. Let me know if you need anything. I'm more than happy to answer your questions in my office. I'm more than willing to answer questions via email. Let me know if you need anything. Metallica rules. Adios, muchachos. I'll see you guys next week.